So this video, I'm going to show you some tips for shading and how to see value better in your drawing. So the first thing that's really important to remember about shading is that shadows are just light, and the way the light is behaving as it wraps around and reflects off forms. So forms are three-dimensional shapes. In a drawing, you're using two-dimensional shapes to create the illusion of three dimensions. So you really have to train your eyes more than your hand when you're working on shading, because usually it's your eyes that are the problem. And you want to work on seeing those values better, because when you can see them better, then you can capture them better. And a good way to practice that is to take away some of the crutches that might be preventing you from realizing you don't have some shading fundamentals. One of those crutches can be looking at color instead of value, or not really observing where light is reflecting on an object. So to help really get your focus, we're going to draw a white object on white, because one problem that a lot of people have is not observing how values relate to other values within the drawing. So they end up overshading or undershading certain parts, and they try to cover it up with a lot of flair to make that not obvious. And in a very detailed drawing with lots of objects, you might not notice the mistakes. But when you've stripped away all the bells and whistles, the mistakes are easier to see. So we want to strip away all of our chances to kind of hide our skills with some of those things and sort of strip it down to its bare bones, which is a white object on a white background. So all I have here is an egg and a piece of computer paper, and I'm creating myself a little scene. You could do this with popcorn too, or any other white objects. But I really want to make sure that I'm only giving myself objects that aren't colored to look at, because I want to be relying on just the shadows and not the color. So thinking about how to put this drawing together, a big mistake that some people make is having a poor reference. So ideal reference is one that you can see right in front of you, like we have here. But a lot of people, when they're struggling with shading, are drawing with no reference at all. Even if you want your drawing style to not look 100% realistic, it is super, super, super important that you have a reference photo to look from, or even multiple reference photos to put together, or to even take one, because it is really, really, really hard to know what light is going to do, because light follows all of those mathematical and physical rules, and those are hard to replicate without seeing them. So it's much better to look at something and see how the light behaves than to try to guess and make it up in your head. And so first, when I'm starting to draw and when I'm really looking at these shadows, some things I want you to notice before we even start the drawing, and I'm going to move my camera here a little bit. So you can see from my angle that I'm looking, it looks a little bit different than from above, but there are lots of parts to look at on this object. So we have what is the light. So this area here where the light is reflecting off is called the center light. Sometimes you'll even have a brighter spot called the highlight. Then as you move around the form, so around the egg, you will get to a section where we have half tones. So these are the areas that are getting some shadow, but they're not fully over onto the shadow side. Then you're going to see sort of a divide. That's called the terminator. And as you cross onto the other side of the terminator, then you're going to get the shadow. So that's the form shadow. You're also going to have cast shadow, which is from the light not being able to hit the surface underneath. And you're also going to have reflected light. So if you look really closely at the shadow side of the egg, you can see that there's this bright spot here, because light isn't just coming, our light source is coming from one direction, but it's also hitting things and bouncing off. And if you're really looking at color, which is another level of realistic shadows, you'll see that the color of the objects around your object affects it. So I've got a little blue box here. You can, if you look really closely, you can see that there's blue light bouncing around on this egg. So you want to be looking at not only where are your shadows and lights, but where is your reflected light? And are you getting the right contrast in that light? And is your light transitioning in the right spots? So let's get started on that. So first I'm going to actually draw the shape of the egg. And from my angle, I'm going to draw a little darker than you should because I want you to be able to see it in the camera. But you really want to avoid drawing too dark or drawing thick outlines, because when I look at that egg, there's not a big black outline around it. There is shadow and there's transition in value, but I'm not seeing a line. I'm just seeing an edge or an implied line. So I don't want to make my outline so dark that I'm going to have that super dark line there. So I just want to really take it easy at the beginning. And so I know my egg has a line of symmetry. So I'm going to see that in there somewhere. If that helps me to draw it, I can. You want to think about as your eye almost carving this object out of the paper rather than creating a mark. So you can see that my initial mark isn't super solid, and I'm trying to just sort of carve that shape closer and closer until I get it right. So as I have my sort of shape down, one thing I want to remember is having the correct range of values in my object. So you can see that my brightest whites are here, but I'm drawing a white object on white paper. So a lot of people, if you're thinking in your left brain, white object on white paper, everything is white, but really it's not. Whites aren't necessarily white and shadows aren't necessarily black. So it's really important that as you're observing what you're looking at, that you're actually looking at what the lights and darks are. It can be really helpful for some people to have an actual value scale sketched out that they can hold up and see, okay, is that a 2? Is that a 0? Is that a 4? So it's important to keep in mind not everything on your drawing is going to be white, even though we know we're looking at a white object, because our brain is really good at translating that information and knowing that that is reflected light and not that the object is changing color. We don't see that as an egg that's turning gray, we see it as an egg in shadow. So we want to duplicate that as best we can to help our drawing look the most realistic. So one thing I can tell is that my background value, while that paper is white, it is darker than the light source area of that egg. So one thing that will help your background sort of recede into the drawing is following the direction of the form with the marks that you're making. So if I want that background to recede and flatten, then I want to create straight marks with my pencil. Some people like to use a technique called laying down a ground, which means they're starting with a light tone on their paper rather than white, because it forces them to actually insert the white instead of relying on the paper white. And that forces them to actually look at where the whites are on their drawing. And so you can see, even just getting that cast is helping that egg stand out. Now, my whole ground is not going to be this one same value, but I'm just getting a tone laid down so that I could see that differentiation. So I do know that my brightest areas are going to be here. So I'm going to get rid of that straight line because it's kind of getting in my way at this point. Because now, as I'm seeing where the darkness is on this egg, I want to try to describe the form of the egg with my marks. So I want to be following that curve and making curved marks, because that's going to help create the illusion of that light bending around the egg. You also want to look at the shapes of your shadows. So if I look at where that terminator line or space is, it can kind of start to draw that in, if that's helpful. So knowing where should that change from being darker to lighter. And so as this core shadow kind of goes around, it's getting sort of darker in this spot as it goes down and under. And so while I'm seeing shadow under there, there are spots where it's darker and spots where it's lighter. And as it goes around this way, so one thing that's important to observe as you're drawing is to see what areas should be lighter and what areas should be darker. So as I'm looking at my drawing right now, this background, the ground I put for the paper, is about the same tone as my cast shadow. I have to really look and decide, is that accurate? Should they be the same darkness? Or should one be lighter or darker than the other? So as you are shading, it is all about comparing points to points, almost like the color picker on a digital drawing program. And I'm testing and observing, is this spot darker than this spot? Is this spot darker or lighter than this spot? What about this spot and this spot? So a lot of it is looking, checking, comparing, and editing your drawing. So I can see this cast shadow in here now. So looking at that cast shadow and really observing the shape that it's casting. So again, I'm trying not to be dark. So I want to be able to add that in. I'm just going to take that up another level of darkness. So remember, we're working on creating an illusion of 3 dimensions on 2 dimensions. And there's a threshold where if you get close, your brain is going to start to fill in the gaps and automatically put the pieces together that might not be there. Just like when you're reading something and there's a missing word, if you're reading fast, your brain just fills it right in and doesn't even notice the word's missing until someone points it out. So same way with your drawing. You might have some simple mistakes there, but if you get close, your brain's going to fill in, and your audience's brain is going to fill in the information, and it isn't going to be very obvious that it's missing. So one important area that's tricky to look at and really important to look at is this area here. Oops. So I'm getting reflected light back here behind the egg. I'm getting cast shadow here, and then I'm getting core shadow here. So those places, it's important to look really, really closely and see what is darker or lighter than the other. Because if I look right here, the egg white is darker than the background white in this spot, but the cast shadow white is darker than the egg shadow white. So I need to make sure that as I am looking at this spot especially, that I need to create that same illusion, because that spot is going to be critical for making this look realistic. So I need that transition there from the paper white, where I have a little more reflected light and highlight there, to the egg white. I can blend that if I want. Then as I'm going down here, that is getting lighter as it goes towards this side. That I think has gotten a little too dark. It can be really tempting to go too dark too fast, but it can also be bad to not go dark enough. I'm starting to just look at the way the light curves around this egg. Those halftones are really important, that they're not as dark as the shadows, but that they're there. And so where this core light is, I'm going to just allow that to kind of stay the paper white. However, my blending has muddied that core light. So you want to be careful with your blending, because I ended up creating darkness in some spots where I didn't want it. That's okay. So really observing how that curves and curls around. Can also see that my drawing is starting to look a little fuzzy. And so I either want to make my marks closer together and smoother, or I'm going to want to come in and blend, either with a blending stump or a my finger paper towel afterwards. So at some point along this edge it transitions from being darker in the object to darker in the background. And it's a very subtle shift, but really observing where that happens. Now, I don't have any H pencils with me at home right now. This would be way easier if I had some, because the H pencils allow you to get these lighter halftones and make them a lot more subtle than you can with just having an HB or a B pencil, because they can only get so light. So down here especially, I'm getting a lot of contrast between that background white and the egg white. I want to avoid from creating an outline there. I want to create an edge, but not an outline. Okay, so because of the way I've been making my marks, I am helping create the curves of that egg. I'm keeping my reflected light. One thing you notice about blending is it lowers your values overall. So you end up smooshing, if you have that value scale, all the way from super dark black to whitest white. Blending smooshes everything to the center. So you lose your highlights, like I did when I was blending there. I lost that highlight and had to bring it back. You also lose the depth of your shadows. So it's important after you're done to go back in and fix any areas where you've made things either too dark now because you've lost your highlight, or your shadow isn't dark enough. Okay, looking at this here, this is too, shouldn't feel like a line there. So that I need to adjust. That should just feel like one solid tone. Looking at where that terminator is, that's where my darkest shadow on the object should be. And looking at the shape of that terminator, okay, so looking at the contrast of my object, I can tell that my cast shadow should be a lot darker than what I have it in my drawing. So I'm going to go back in and darken that up, especially down here. And I'm really looking at this spot right here, because from my perspective, it's really difficult to see in that spot kind of where the egg ends and the paper begins. It looks a little different on the camera. That looks really obvious there, but you want to really look and see what you're observing and making sure that matches your drawing. I can definitely tell that should be more subtle contrast, where here around the edge of the egg should be a more sharp contrast. There should be a definite edge where that egg hits the shadow. So now it's really all about going and looking and checking in those really important spaces. Does your light and your shadow, do your shadows create the correct shape? And are they lighter and darker in the correct places? So places here where it gets a little ambiguous, changing the direction of your shading can be really helpful to make sure that pops out correctly. So ideally, anywhere I would be seeing a line shouldn't really be a line. It should be a place where a lighter value and a darker value are lining up against each other. So it is not actually a white and a white with a black line through it. It is two tones touching each other. Okay, so now if I introduced an object of a different value or a different color, this drawing would change a lot. And I would probably be doing lots of adjustments to adjust and change how is the darker object relating to the lighter object and those shadows and the way things are casting. But if you can get an egg looking three-dimensional on your paper, then you're on your way to observing shadows and light correctly and replicating them in your drawings. And if you can get those fundamental skills down, it won't matter what you're shading. Even you'll be able to advance into objects like glass or metal, because the only thing that makes glass or metal look glass or metal is that the light is being bounced and reflected differently. And so you just really have to look closely at what the light is doing and try not to let your brain trick you of what it should be doing. So, happy shading.